It happened just after 1 in the morning, while a city built on 1,000 years of Moorish stone was asleep. No warning siren, no forecast model tracking a slow-moving front, nothing that gave the people of Granada even a minute to prepare, just the ground itself deciding, without notice to move. And when it stopped, tiles were down in the streets, cornices had cracked off centuries-old facades, and thousands of residents were standing outside in the dark in whatever they'd been wearing when their beds started shaking. This is the story of a 5.2 magnitude earthquake that struck the heart of Andalusia, and of why the people who study this ground are telling you it is far from finished sending signals. According to Spain's Instituto Geográfico Nacional, the quake struck at 1:04 in the morning local time on Saturday, August 15th, 2026, with its epicenter roughly 1 kilometer southwest of Alhendín, a town that sits inside the greater Granada metropolitan area, barely 10 kilometers from the historic city center itself. The depth was shallow, only about 2 kilometers beneath the surface, and that single number, shallow, is the reason this earthquake did not feel like a distant rumble. It felt, to the people standing in it, instead of dispersing it through kilometers of rock first, and that is why a magnitude that might sound moderate on paper turned into cracked walls, falling debris, and one deeply unsettling night for an entire province. The National Geographic Institute's first read put the number at 5.0. Within hours, that had been revised upward with some monitoring, networks placing it at 5.2. That kind of adjustment is not unusual in the first hours after a major seismic event, and it is worth understanding why. Seismologists are working from a live stream of ground motion data arriving from dozens of stations at once, and the earliest estimate is always a first approximation. As more waveforms arrive and get cross-checked, the number sharpens. What did not change in any version of the data was where this thing sat on the scale of what Granada province has experienced in modern memory. This was, by a wide margin, the strongest jolt to hit the area in years. But that is only the beginning of what makes this event significant. Because this was not an isolated rupture appearing out of nowhere on a quiet Friday night. According to reporting drawing on the IGN catalog, this 5.2 was the peak moment of a seismic swarm that had already been building in Granada province since the day before, August 14th. A swarm is exactly what it sounds like, a cluster of earthquakes, some small, some not, occurring in close succession in the same general area, without one obvious single main shock leading. The sequence from the start. Swarms behave differently from a classic single main shock aftershock pattern, and that difference matters enormously for what comes next because it changes how confidently anyone can say the danger has passed. That is not the full story either. In the immediate aftermath of the 5.2, monitoring networks recorded a string of aftershocks above magnitude 2, one of them registering 2.6 roughly 30 minutes after the main shock. And the sequence did not stop there. Smaller tremors, continuing rippling through the following days, with a magnitude 3.1 near Armilla on August 16th, and multiple events above magnitude. 3 clustered around the town of Gojar on the 15th. As of the morning of August 18th, the ground was still moving. A 4.8 magnitude quake struck near Alhendín that same morning, just 1 kilometer from the original epicenter. 3 days after the main shock, and the shaking radiated far beyond the immediate epicenter. Reports of the tremor being felt reached Madrid, Murcia, Albacete, and Ciudad Real, provinces that sit well outside Andalusia entirely. That is the kind of reach that tells you this was not a localized rattle confined to one neighborhood. This was a regional event, felt across a meaningful stretch of the Iberian Peninsula in the middle of the night, waking people who had no expectation that this was coming. And here's where it gets more serious, because Granada is not just any city. It is one of Spain's most visited destinations, home to the Alhambra, the UNESCO-listed Nasrid Palace complex that draws billions of travelers every year and represents centuries of irreplaceable architectural heritage. When shallow, moderate earthquakes start clustering directly beneath a city built around structures that old, the concern is never only about the immediate shake. It is about what repeated shaking does, tremor after tremor, to buildings and monuments that were never engineered for this building, and why the seismologists watching this swarm are being careful not to say it is over. What officials found, once daylight came, confirmed what residents already suspected from the sound of it in the dark. In Granada, falling building material, cracked facades, and damaged roofs were reported across multiple neighborhoods, with debris in at least one instance landing directly on a vehicle parked beside a residential building. Emergency crews moved street by street, inspecting structures to determine which ones remained safe to occupy and which needed to be closed off. Authorities urged residents to stay clear of facades, cornices, balconies, and any wall that showed visible cracking, since those are exactly the elements most likely to fail if another jolt arrives without warning. That warning was not precautionary language. It was a direct response to what a shallow earthquake does to unreinforced masonry, which is to loosen exactly the kind of decorative and structural elements that then become falling hazards for days or weeks afterward, long after the initial shaking has stopped. The good news, and it is real good news, is what did not happen. Officials confirmed no fatalities and no serious injuries, and critically, the Alhambra itself, the 8th-century-old palace complex that stands as the crown jewel of Spain's Islamic architectural heritage, came through without reported serious damage. Given the age and construction of that site, that is not a small detail. It is the difference between a frightening night and a cultural catastrophe. But the absence of injury does not mean the absence of consequence, and the regional government of Andalusia did not treat this as a one-off scare. Authorities activated Level 1 of the region's Seismic Risk Plan, a formal emergency response tier that mobilizes coordinated monitoring and response resources across the affected province. The Andalusia emergency line fielded more than 80 calls in the hours following the main shock, and at least one building underwent a preventive evacuation while inspectors assessed whether it remained structurally sound, into parts of the Pyrenees. The mechanism driving it is the slow, grinding convergence between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, a collision that has been building stress. Both have struck over just the past decade, averaging out to roughly one such event every month. Most of those passed without national headlines. This one did not, because of where it centered and how shallow it sat. That is why forecasters and seismologists are paying close attention to what comes next. And here is where the honest uncertainty has to come in, because earthquake science does not work the way weather forecasting does. There is no model that can tell you 3 days out that a magnitude 5 is coming to a specific town at a specific hour. What seismologists can tell you once a swarm like this is underway is how sequences like it have historically behaved and what to watch for. A swarm can taper off over days with aftershocks gradually shrinking in size and frequency until the ground settles back to its normal background hum. Or, less commonly but not impossibly, a swarm can be a precursor, a sign of stress redistributing along a fault system that eventually produces a larger rupture than the ones that came before it. Right now, based on the sequence observed CE, NC August 14th, there is no confirmed indication this swarm is escalating towards something larger. The events since the 5.2 main shock, including that magnitude 4.8 on the 18th, have remained below the size of the original shock, which is the pattern typically associated with a standard aftershock decay rather than a building crescendo. But that is our read on a pattern still in progress, not a guarantee, and honest seismology never pretends otherwise. There's another wrinkle worth understanding here, because it explains why a magnitude 5.2 can dominate headlines, while the region's seismic history includes numbers that are far more dramatic. Historical catalogs list a magnitude 7.8 event associated with the Granada area dating back to 1954, though that earthquake occurred at an extraordinary depth of more than 600 kilometers, deep enough that its energy dissipated across hundreds of kilometers of rock before reaching the surface, producing far less surface shaking T. And its raw magnitude would suggest. Compare that to this swarm sitting at depths of only 2 to 10 kilometers, and you understand why proximity to the surface matters as much as the number itself. A shallow 5.2 arriving directly beneath a populated metropolitan area will be felt, and will do damage, in a way a deep 7.8 sometimes will not. Magnitude alone never tells the whole story. Depth decides how much of that energy actually reaches the people standing above it. The forecast becomes more complicated from here because Granada is now a province operating under an active emergency plan, continued aftershock monitoring, and a populatio. And that has been told, correctly, to remain cautious around damaged structures while inspections continue. Next, we go through exactly what residents and officials should be matching for in the days ahead, what history tells us about how long swarms like this typically last, and what this means for a city that depends heavily on tourism to a monument that just came within a shallow fault line's distance of catastrophe. For residents of Alhendín and the surrounding towns, the days since August 15th have settled into an uneasy rhythm. You feel a tremor, you check whether it registered above a magnitude that matters. You wait to see if the next one is smaller or larger than the last. That is what living inside an active seismic swarm actually looks like, not one. A dramatic night followed by silence, but a stretched out sequence where the ground keeps reminding you it has not finished settling. The magnitude 4.8 recorded near Alhendín in the morning of August 18th, 3 days after the main shock, and essentially on top of the original epicenter, is a clear signal that this sequence is still active. It is not, based on everything seismologists have observed so far, a sign of imminent escalation, but it is also not nothing, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest to the people, still sleeping with one ear open in Granada province. Here is what history and pattern recognition can offer, even without a precise forecast. Aftershock sequences, following a shallow, moderate main shock, typically follow what seismologists sometimes describe informally as a decay curve, meaning the frequency and average size of the following tremors tends to diminish over time, though rarely in a perfectly smooth line. There can be smaller flare-ups along the way, a magnitude 3 one day, a magnitude 4, a few days later that feels like a step backward even though it remains, NS well below the original main shock. That appears to be roughly the shape of what Granada has experienced so far, a 5.0 to 5.2 main shock, a scatter of aftershocks in the 2 TO3 range in the immediate hours after, and then a somewhat larger 4.8 event days later that still sits comfortably below the original rupture. Confidence that this represents typical aftershock behavior, rather than the build-up to something larger, is reasonably high based on the pattern to date, but it is not absolute, and it will not become a absolute until enough additional days pass without escalation. That is the honest, uncomfortable truth about earthquake forecasting that separates it fundamentally from tracking a hurricane or a stalled frontal boundary. With a tropical system, meteorologists can watch steering currents, wind shear, and sea surface temperatures, and generate a probability cone with real predictive power days in advance. With earthquakes, there is no equivalent early warning window for the event itself. Seismic early warning systems, where they exist, can provide a few seconds to perhaps a minute of notice once a rupture has already begun, using the gap between fast-moving initial waves and the slower, more destructive shaking that follows. But there is currently no reliable way to say, days ahead of time, that a fault beneath a specific town will rupture at a specific hour. What officials can do, and what Andalusia's regional government has done by activating its Seismic Risk Plan, is prepare the response infrastructure so that when the ground does move again, whether that is a minor aftershock or something larger, resources, inspection teams, and emergency communication lines are already positioned rather than being assembled from scratch in the panic of the moment. This is where the bigger picture around Granada's tourism economy becomes impossible to ignore. The Alhambra alone draws millions of visitors annually, and the broader historic core of Granada, with its centuries-old churches, its winding Albaicín quarter, and its dense concentration of protected heritage buildings, represents one of the most architecturally significant urban cores in all of Europe. Buildings from the medieval and early modern periods were not engineered with modern seismic codes in mind, and repeated shallow shaking, even at moderate magnitudes, has a cumulative effect on masonry and mortar that a single isolated event would not produce. That is precisely why the preventive evacuation of at least one structure and the systematic building-by-building inspections carried out by emergency crews matter as much as the headline magnitude number. The damage from an earthquake swarm is not only what falls the night of the main shock, it is what gets structurally compromised and only becomes visible or dangerous days or weeks later. The same setup that produced this swarm is also part of a much longer, well-documented pattern for this region. Southern Spain's seismicity is a direct consequence of the ongoing slow-motion collision between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, a process playing out along a broad, complex boundary zone that runs through the Betic Cordillera, the mountain system that Granada itself sits within. This is why earthquake monitoring networks log dozens of magnitude 4+ events within a few hundred kilometers of Granada every single year, most of them unnoticed outside seismological circles. It is also why, when a swarm produces something in the 5 range, directly beneath a populated area at shallow depth, it stands out so sharply against that quieter background pattern. According to Spain's National Geographic Institute, this represents the most significant seismic event to hit the immediate Granada metropolitan area in a meaningful stretch of recent years, which is exactly why the regional government's emergency activation was not an overreaction, but a proportionate response to a real and still unfolding situation. What happens next depends largely on whether the sequence continues its apparent decay or produces another notable jolt in the coming days. Forecasters and seismologists are watching daily, and residents are being advised to keep following official guidance on which buildings remain safe. In the closing section, we bring together what this swarm means for Granada right now, what officials are telling residents to watch for, and why an earthquake that caused no deaths can still carry lessons that matter for a city built on 1,000 years of history sitting atop one of Europe's most active fault systems. So where does this leave Granada right now, as of this week? The swarm that began on August 14th and peaked with the magnitude 5.2 main shock in the early hours of August 15th has not fully gone quiet. The magnitude 4.8 aftershock recorded on the morning of August 18th, sitting almost precisely atop the original epicenter near Alhendín, is the clearest evidence that the sequence remains active even as it appears, based on the pattern observed so far, to be gradually tapering rather than building towards something larger. That is a measured, honest way to describe where things stand. Not resolved, not escalating. Active, monitored, and still capable of producing further tremors that residents will feel. No fatalities, no serious injuries. That outcome, given a shallow magnitude, 5.2 striking directly beneath a metropolitan area of hundreds of thousands of people, is not something to take for granted. It reflects a combination of building codes that have improved since the region's more damaging historical earthquakes, timing that happened to fall in the very early morning hours when most residents were indoors and away from windows and balconies, and simple fortune in a scenario where the outcome could easily have been far worse. The Alhambra, standing without serious reported damage, is its own piece of fortune layered on top of that, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has now weathered 8 centuries of history, including, this past weekend, a shallow seismic swarm directly on its doorstep. What officials are asking residents to watch for now is straightforward and worth repeating clearly. Stay away from facades, cornices, balconies, and any wall showing visible cracking, because those elements can fail well after the initial shaking is passed, sometimes triggered by nothing more than a minor aftershock, or even just gravity finally winning against a weakened structure. Follow the guidance of emergency services regarding which buildings have been. Handful of additional tremors does not automatically mean something larger is coming. Confidence in a full resolution will build the same way it always does with these sequences, through the accumulation of days without a significant event, not through any single all-clear announcement. There's a broader takeaway here that extends beyond Granada's city limits, and it is worth sitting with. This swarm is a reminder that southern Spain sits inside a genuinely active seismic zone, one shaped by the ongoing convergence of tectonic, to wake an entire province and put a seismic risk plan into active operation. The region has seen larger numbers in its historical record, including that deep 7.8 event from 1954, and it will likely see notable seismic activity again, because that is simply the nature of a landscape built on a plate boundary. What matters in the meantime is preparedness that does not rely on advance warning, because with earthquakes, unlike a slow-moving storm system, advance warning of days or hours essentially does not exist. It comes down to building codes, inspection systems, emergency communication lines, and a public that knows what to do in the seconds during a tremor and the days immediately after one. For now, the picture in Granada is one of relief mixed with vigilance. Relief that this event, significant as it was, did not take a life or seriously damage the city's most treasured landmark. Vigilance because the ground beneath Alhendín is still producing aftershocks, because the regional emergency plan remains active, and because inspection crews are still working through buildings that sustained visible damage. The swarm that started on August 14th is, as of this week, best described as ongoing but not escalating, a distinction that matters enormously for how residents should be thinking about their next few days. This is a story we will continue watching closely, because active seismic swarms do not follow a fixed schedule. And the difference between this sequence winding down quietly over the coming days and producing one more notable jolt is not something anyone can predict with certainty right now. What we can tell you, based on everything monitored so far, is that Granada's emergency services remain on alert, aftershock monitoring continues around the clock, and the numbers being tracked, magnitude, depth, frequency, are the ones that will tell the next chapter of this story. Stay with us as we continue following the situation in Granada, the ongoing inspection results, and whether this swarm settles or produces another chapter before it's finished.